Welcome back to our Future of U.S.-China conference. As a reminder, our program with today's lineup and all of our speaker bios are in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions for our speakers at any time, please use that Q&A box. We have a terrific audience with us as well, including consul generals from China, Singapore, the Philippines, and Canada. Now, before we took a break, we looked inside China, and now we're going to look externally. Session 5 is China-U.S. strategic issues during the Biden administration. With us, Admiral William Fallon, Bonnie Glaser, Evan Medeiros, and moderating this session is our Northern California chair, Ken Wilcox. Ken.
Thank you very much, Margaret. I really appreciate the introduction. I'm so happy to be here today. I'm the chairman of the Asia Society here in Northern California. As Margaret said, our topic today is China-U.S. strategic issues during the Biden administration. And not a minute too soon, I would say, given the fact that the Biden administration is expected to start in a mere 6 days. We have a great panel. I'll add a word about each one of them before we jump in. First, Bonnie Glaser, who is a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., with a focus on Asia-Pacific security and Chinese foreign and security policy. We also have Dr. Evan Medeiros, who's the Penner Family Chair in Asia Studies in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He also focuses on U.S.-China relations and China's foreign and national security policies. And we also have William J. Fallon, a retired four-star admiral from the U.S. Navy. In his last assignment as commander, U.S. Central Command, Admiral Fallon directed all U.S. military operations in the Middle East, Horn of Africa, and Central Asia, focused on combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan in 2007 and 2006. So I would like to begin with each of our panelists giving a short, let's say 5-minute presentation on a topic of interest to them relative to their area of expertise. And following that, we'll proceed with questions, initially with a number of questions that I've already collected from the audience, and then following that with questions that emerge during the course of this presentation. So with that, let me begin by asking Bill to start things off. Admiral Fallon.
Very much. Thanks, Ken. And I might add that for the 2 years prior to my command in CENTCOM, I was out in the Pacific as the commander of the Asia Pacific region for the U.S. I think what I'd like to begin with is just a little bit of a scene setter in this business discussion about the relationship between China and the U.S. I think in a nutshell, it is the most important relationship in the world for us as we look to the future. And I think it has been for some time for quite a few reasons, economic, militarily, political. There's a long list of things, but in my opinion, the U.S. has not had it as its number one issue. We've been very much, I believe, preoccupied with other things, domestic affairs, politics, certainly in the Middle East. I believe that our relationship recently has been reactive, transactional, probably confrontational, and that this trend combined with some things going on in China have led to an escalation in tensions and an increase in the rivalry between the two countries. And if it continues in this manner, I think it doesn't bode well for the future of both countries and the rest of the world. But I don't want to be totally negative, because I think there are all kinds of opportunities here to do some things differently. First of all, I mentioned the U.S. side and our lack of focus, and in my opinion, lack of a strategic policy directed towards China. And not so much what we're going to do about China. I'd like to see us spend more attention on ourselves and what we're going to do and what we want ourselves to do, particularly in this relationship with China over the next 5 to 10 years going into the future. So to get out of the reactive business and start doing a little bit of preemptive and premeditated thinking and acting to put us in a better place than we apparently are headed these days. But to understand the background, I think it's essential to recognize that since Xi Jinping has taken over as the primary leader in China, he's certainly consolidated power. And he and the CCP, the Communist Party in China, have a vision. It's called the China Dream. And contrary to my view of the US, this vision and the strategy that goes with it is pretty well thought out and articulated. And some key aspects of that are as follows. I believe that China is working hard to restore what in their minds was the historic greatness of their country. So they've got a history that goes back for thousands of years. They look at us and say, hey, you folks have been around for a couple hundred, there's no comparison. So we've been there and done that, and we've seen things go up and down. And lately, we're trying to restore the great power image that this is China, enjoyed in the past. And they think that the 19th and 20th century for the country of China was not good. They feel humiliated. They feel that they were made to feel subservient, particularly to the Western powers that spent a fair amount of time occupying the country. And from my Navy background, if I could put this in a thought, today, if we had a Chinese gunboat up the Mississippi River in the upper reaches, we would probably be pretty aghast and not very comfortable and not very happy. Well, back in the 1930s, the U.S. Navy, in fact, had gunboats 1,000 miles up the rivers of China as part of the foreign presence, if you would, in China. They didn't like that, and they're determined to change that. There's also something to keep in mind, and that's the preoccupation in China of Japan. The fact that Japan had invaded the country, had taken over Manchuria, most of the eastern part of China, during the 30s and 40s is something that left a lot of scars and hasn't been forgotten, and I believe is a key factor. The other thing today is, based on our behaviors, the Chinese perception, in my mind, is that we've become weak. And this weakness gives them opportunities to expand their vision, to take a place of dominance in the world, basically at our expense, because they don't think we're in a position to do too much about it. They have a lot of factors going in their direction right now, and their economy is number one. So just look at what's happened in the past year since the COVID attack the virus was discovered. They went into a total lockdown, pretty draconian by our standards. We probably would never do something quite like that, but they did. And now they've recovered their economy in a very, very dramatic fashion, and they're moving onward and upward. And so this, the confidence that this gives them, I think, is part of what's driving this. A couple of other points. China is looking for a new world order. They recognize the fact, and they've benefited extensively from the U.S. Written rules, if you would, after World War II. The Western nations got together and pretty much set the world order with norms and behaviors and institutions. The Chinese feel that this tilts the power towards us. They'd like to change that, and they're working on it in a lot of ways. First and foremost, they want to retain power. They want to keep the CCP in power. They call it socialism with Chinese characteristics. It's not like the communism of the Cold War. It's significantly different. The commonality is the authoritarian rule in Beijing and the lack of tolerance for any dissent. They believe their system's superior to the Western democracies. That's a going-in position. And so this has tended to fuel a bit of hubris, I believe. It's certainly fueled their military ambitions and their activities, notably in the maritime domain, East China Sea, South China Sea. So the tangent or the direction of their activities is pretty much coming into conflict with us. And again, we haven't done much to change that track. So as we go forward, it seems to me we're going to have to we need to make some changes in our priorities. And I believe in coming to grips with the big picture vision for how we want to portray ourselves in the future. And that relationship with China is going to be, again, the most important relationship. Why don't I end there and turn it back over to you, Ken? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Bonnie, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you. I wasn't sure if I was next. Thank you so much to you and the Asia Society for having me on the panel today. I wanted to talk just a little bit about China's assessment of the global balance of power, or what the former Soviet Union used to call the correlation of forces. And I see that China's assessment of the global balance of power really is one of the critical determinants of Chinese foreign policy. And when China was a relatively weak nation, especially, of course, vis-a-vis the United States, it pursued a policy of hide your capabilities and bide your time while getting something accomplished. That was Deng Xiaoping's policy that he created. And when Hu Jintao came to power, he modified this guideline a bit, but he didn't abandon it. He said China should actively seek to get something accomplished. Now, Xi Jinping came to power and he jettisoned this policy. He called for China, for those who speak Chinese, to Fen Fa You Wei. Difficult to translate, but it's something like exerting oneself to the utmost will bring success. In other words, forge ahead. And this is against the background of an assessment that the world is, the international situation today is moving in China's favor. So China's global strategy and foreign policy is really profoundly influenced by key events that altered its perception of American power. And this goes back to certainly the end of the Cold War. The 2008 global financial crisis was a very important turning point. And now the coronavirus pandemic of 2020. So Xi Jinping has maintained publicly that the pattern of global governance depends upon the balance of power. And he has said the transformation of the global governance system originates from changes in the global balance of power. This is why China has said today, under Xi Jinping, that it not only wants to participate in global governance reform, it wants to lead global governance reform. So I say a few words about the global financial crisis turning point. At that time, China concluded that the United States was really beginning to decline. This was followed by Chinese assertive actions in the East China Sea with the establishment of an air defense identification zone, South China Sea with the island building and militarization. And we saw early signs of what a decade later came to be called wolf warrior diplomacy. And now the pandemic is seen by China as an accelerator. Now, of course, the Chinese continues to see hurdles to their rise. I think there's deep recognition of the challenges that they face and the vulnerabilities that they have. But I think overall, Xi Jinping is quite confident about China's direct trajectory and sees opportunities today that he wants to seize upon. And China is using its expanding toolkit to pressure and coerce many of its neighbors and countries around the world. There was just an article about a month ago by the executive vice president of the Central Party School, He Yiting. He's a key theorist in Xi Jinping's inner circle. He wrote in the pages of People's Daily, the international balance of power is undergoing the most revolutionary change in modern times. And he said that the profound adjustment of this balance of power, especially, he said, that the East is rising and the West is declining, is the main direction for the development of the future. And he cited explicitly the global pandemic as a catalyst that will accelerate great change in the world. So some have said that Xi Jinping recognizes that China has overreached and it will moderate its wolf warrior diplomacy, its economic coercion, and other behaviors, that it will seek compromises on territorial disputes and differences with the United States. And to the contrary, to be blunt and provocative, I believe we're at the beginning of a new wave of Chinese foreign policy and diplomatic and military assertiveness. I think China is likely to continue its gray zone pressure on Taiwan, not necessarily use military force. But Beijing's goal is to erode the confidence of the people of Taiwan in their government, their ability to preserve the status quo, and their confidence in the United States. Along the border with India, China has shifted the line of control, occupying territory previously controlled by India, and it's seeking New Delhi's acquiescence to the new status quo. Of course, in the South China Sea, China is incrementally increasing its control over activities in those waters. They have already changed the status quo in their favor, and I believe they'll continue to press their advantage. We've seen what's going on in Hong Kong. The Chinese have implemented the national security legislation much more quickly and aggressively than many observers predicted. And I doubt that international sanctions will have an impact on Chinese policies. So I think that, one remaining hope of influencing Chinese policies going forward is multilateral coordinated pushback. Beijing fears the formation of a coalition that is designed to impose costs on China. Not necessarily anti-China coalition across the board, but at least to try to influence China's behavior on specific issues. We see China's concerns about the Quad, for example, have increased tremendously. So the Biden administration has said it wants to work with allies to advance an agenda to protect democracies and partners, and we'll have to wait to see what this entails and whether or not it will make headway. And I'll turn the floor back to you, Ken.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. Okay, Evan.
Well, thank you, Ken, and thanks to the Asia Society for putting together this very timely panel. And it's a pleasure to share the stage, the digital stage, with Bill and Bonnie. And I very much appreciated their insightful presentations. What I was asked to talk about today is the trajectory of U.S. policy toward China. I think Bill and Bonnie did an exceptional job outlining how the Chinese look at the United States and some of the policies and rhetoric they're using toward the United States. I want to look at the other side of the equation. How is the United States under a Biden administration going to approach it? Obviously, this is a speculative enterprise, given the fact that Biden hasn't been inaugurated yet. But I think we're, at least as a longtime China watcher, I think that we can discern actually some pretty good, with good clarity, what the outlines of Biden's China strategy are going to be. They have already agreed very publicly with the framing of China as a strategic competitor. Jake Sullivan has talked about the relationship as one of comprehensive strategic competition. Senior Biden officials or campaign people have used terms like confront, compete, and cooperate with China simultaneously. So I think we have the bookends of what a Biden strategy is going to look like. This, in terms of specific manifestations, they've outlined at least 4 specific lines of work: doing more with allies, embedding the U.S. more in multilateral institutions to create, to bind China. Number 3, more democracy promotion. And 4, domestic renewal, investing more in the United States to ensure that the U.S. has the basis for long-term competition with China. In practical terms, what that means is probably doing more with Europe, less emphasis on the kind of systematic economic decoupling that the Trump team talked about. So my first point is, I think the general outlines of goals and strategies are pretty clear, though the specific policies will have to wait and see how they evolve. Second point, personnel decisions are going to be key. We know some of the key cabinet picks, and these are all people with a lot of experience with China. I think very few of them look at China through rose-colored glasses. Many of them I've worked with personally, people like Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken. They have absolutely no illusions about the nature of the China challenge. But, as somebody that's spent a lot of time at the NSC, there's no getting away from what will ultimately be the organic process by which the principals sit around the table in the Situation Room and debate China. And so the things that I'll be looking for is once Biden gets in place and starts governing, how is he going to frame the China challenge? How are they going to organize themselves for interagency debates and deliberations? What types of priorities do they set? How do they communicate with China? What kind of architecture do they sort of agree on? And then how are they going to resolve the inevitable trade-offs? And so I think personnel is going to be key to all of that. Third point, the state of the relationship. I think they inherit a relationship that's in a pretty bad place, but it's not in total and utter free fall. So the challenges are obvious: Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Chinese assertions, as Bonnie, I think, very articulately pointed out. But other issues in the relationship are simply the fact that the entire architecture for communicating with the Chinese has atrophied away, and they're going to have to rebuild that. So the good news is the Chinese very badly want to reset. So the relationship itself needs a lot of renovation, but the Chinese want to reset. They want stability. They want predictability. They don't want to go back to the volatility and the confrontation. They've got a lot of things going on at home that increase their incentives for stability, like in July of this year, the anniversary of the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, and then the Olympics in Beijing in February. So the Chinese have their own incentives for stability. So the relationship's in a rough state, needs quite a bit of work, but I see incentives on both sides to find some kind of equilibrium point. Last point I'll make is, like any good transition, there are going to be some tough decision points. And I think there's going to be quite a bit of debate among advisors about the following issues. Number one, how much to emphasize cooperation, especially on climate change and COVID, over competition, and in particular, how to sequence it. I can imagine Secretary Kerry coming in and saying, we need to put climate change cooperation with China at the top of the agenda. And the question is how does that undercut other dimensions of their China strategy? Number two, how much to look at the competition with China and frame it in terms of an ideological or values-based competition as the Biden team seeks to set up this global summit on democracies. How to deal with economic issues, in particular the tariffs, since we all know it's American businesses, consumers, and workers that pay for the tariffs. How long is the Biden team going to tolerate them? And then, as I mentioned before, how do they want to structure dialogue with the Chinese? The Chinese love these, big, elaborate structures like the strategic and economic dialogue. I think there's a lot of frustration in the U.S. side with them. So how do they structure dialogue? How do they sequence the interactions early on with the Chinese to send signals about the degree of confrontation, competition, and cooperation in the relationship? So let me turn it back to you, Ken. And just a quick reminder, unfortunately, I have family obligations that are going to require me to leave a little early. So my deep apologies to all of the viewers today, but you're in incredibly capable hands with Bill and Bonnie. So over to you, Ken. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. And that means you've got to promise to come back again and make up for
absolutely
fulfilling your family obligations at some point in the future.
Absolutely committed.
Well, this is an incredibly good start here, filled with lots of pithy information that we can begin by hacking into and posing some additional questions that would invite our speakers to go just a little deeper. Bill, I'd like to start with something that you alluded to. This is in terms of the way China sees the U.S. You said, and I think correctly so, that China sees us as fundamentally weak today. And I think that's probably true in so many different ways. And in particular, I think that you mentioned, or if you didn't, my imagination did, our military capabilities. Could you, or anybody at this point, anybody's entitled to jump in with responses. How weak are we in relative terms, and how accurate is their perception, do you think?
I believe the perception is inaccurate, but I understand how they come to their conclusions. And I think it's based on a number of things that are directly related to our military and theirs, and then some peripheral issues too. So, for example, their observation of the U.S. Navy's behavior in the last several years in the Western Pacific in terms of seeming inability to keep ships from running into one another and running around like dogs with our tongues hanging out due to, in my opinion, overuse of certain assets, again, directly related back to the Middle East and the demand signal for forces over there. So as they look at us, I believe that their military leaders are probably telling the political bosses that these guys aren't as big and strong as maybe they used to be or as they would think they are. And so we ought to keep pushing and just to see kind of what we can do here. And I think that would be a mistake. But from our side, we have in fact struggled with readiness because we've been, in my opinion, overusing our forces, the maritime forces in particular. And we need to reset that. And I think we've got some very strong capabilities that we can bring to bear. But again, it's not. I'm firmly convinced that the incorrect response is to look at things that China's doing, and then say, "Aha, we don't like that. We're going to make them stop that, or we're going to try to coerce them into some other behavior or whatever." And that we would be much better served if our national strategy put a primacy on making this country strong and giving us a foundation from which to operate in foreign policy and in other things. And I believe that really starts domestically, back here at home, where we fix, if you would, those illnesses of late. Politically, they look at us and they say, and I've been in meetings with the Chinese where they kind of guffaw and say, "Look, you characters, you can't even talk to one another in Washington, and your system is broken. Look at the response. If it's COVID, look at the response to this, that, or the other thing. You're incapable. Look at us." They say, we're stable, we're predictable, and we don't have this trouble. And so therefore, we think your system is coming apart. We can fix that. We can fix it beginning here in a week if our leaders will get together and figure out how to pull the country together and get moving, and then fix some things that the Chinese have been pretty good at. They've been very excellent in education, and we've been mediocre of late. We've lost the mojo, I think, in many respects, particularly in our early education. Again, quite fixable. Infrastructure. Go to China, you look at all this new stuff that they've got, come back and look at us and say, what are we doing here? So it isn't just about things that look good. It's about fixing things and making things work. And I think that the other fact is that as they look at our relationships with other countries, and they see the squabbling, they see the alliances that are coming apart, and they say, "Aha, everybody else sees it too. This can all be fixed, should be fixed." And there are a lot more countries around the world than China. Collectively, we can do all kinds of things. So Bonnie and Evan have highlighted a couple of key things. Alliances and partnerships, indispensable in my opinion. And when we get people to work together, particularly in alliances, not necessarily shaped and formed to sharpen the spear and jab it in China's eye, but to work for the constructive good of the countries involved, ourselves in the Pacific, Japan, Australia, South Korea, and so forth. All kinds of good things can happen. And I think that's really the fundamental thing that needs to take place. Our military will, I believe, fix itself with the right strategic vision that it's given, and coming at some of these internal issues that have been nagging us. This is all fixable. but it shouldn't be used as a tool to whap China in the face or poke them in the eye at every turn. We ought to go about our business. We're good. We've got a tremendous history and a capability of performance in an excellent manner. We need to go back to that, get back to basics, demonstrate our capability to ourselves. People are going to take notice. So I'm a strong believer in the have a big stick but speak softly. We've reversed that of late. We've been jabbing and jabbering, running at the mouth, and following that up with some, I think, fairly stupid, provocative activities that are actually the opposite of what we ought to be doing. So the military, yes, we've got challenges, but we have answers for most of these challenges. Enough.
Thank you very much. That's very reassuring. And I'm always happy to hear Teddy Roosevelt being quoted. So thank you. Bonnie, I wanted to ask you, actually, let me interject here. The questions are rolling in at a marathon pace. So I'm going to take some of these questions and combine them with ones that I had already thought about and pose them. And please, again, any of the panelists should jump in whenever they have a thought on any of these. But Bonnie, you had mentioned a term that we've heard a couple of times today, and of course we've all read, wolf warrior diplomacy. And you mentioned, I think, a series of what I perceive to be instances of its having been exercised. What is, if you wanted to further define wolf warrior diplomacy, feel free, because I'm not sure everybody has the same definition. Be that as it may, what is the goal of wolf warrior diplomacy? Is it psychological or is it practical? And is it meant simply to intimidate or to make a statement, or is there something else that the Chinese government is trying to achieve? And I'm thinking in particular of a couple of situations that you mentioned, and one in particular comes to mind, the South China Sea. I really wonder what's the purpose of those artificial islands.
Well, it would be a long discussion if we talk about the purpose of their artificial islands, but that does go back to really actually the era before Xi Jinping. The PLA was pushing to build those islands just as they were pushing to create the air defense identification zone in the East China Sea. In other words, Xi Jinping approved proposals that the PLA had made previously. And the Chinese felt that they were falling behind in the South China Sea, but they saw an opportunity, and they want to have effective control over all of the activities taking place in the South China Sea. And they also want to be able to project force from those islands. So that's that in itself is a very long discussion. But wolf warrior diplomacy is this phrase originated really, I actually think it was a Westerner who has used this phrase. The Chinese Foreign Ministry hates it. They think that it is an inaccurate way to describe their diplomats. But it does describe not only, in my view, the rhetoric, but also the behavior. And we can look now, for example, at China's trade restrictions, which are very non-transparent and are not consistent with the WTO, that they are exercising now against Australia, but have actually exercised against more than a dozen countries previously. We've seen this against Japan and South Korea, goes all the way back to Norway in 2010. Every time that a government pursues a policy that they don't like, they use a toolkit to try and penalize countries and compel them to change those policies that are damaging to Chinese interests. So I don't think it is simply limited to the very harsh language we are hearing from the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman, and that's my own definition. Secretary Pompeo has spoken about China in very nasty ways. Yes, China's Foreign Ministry spokesman has also spoken tough language in response, but that is not the sum total of wolf warrior diplomacy. And I would say it is a function of China's growing confidence, which I described in my opening remarks. But what I'd like to highlight in answer to your question, Ken, is that the target is first and foremost domestic. The Chinese Communist Party must be seen as protecting the interests of its country, right? And particularly when it comes to sovereignty and territorial disputes. And so even if this policy has a negative impact in terms of China's international reputation, which public opinion polls show there has been a negative impact, this is a very popular policy at home. And the Chinese Foreign Ministry has been encouraged by higher levels, possibly even by Xi Jinping himself, to continue this kind of posture. I'll just add one last sentence for those interested in this issue. I probably shouldn't plug somebody else's book, but I'm in the process of reading a book which hasn't come out yet, but it's going to come out soon, by Peter Martin of the Financial Times. I think that's what he is. Apologies if I've mischaracterized where he works. But Peter has written a great book on world foreign diplomacy and traces it back to the very early period of the founding of the People's Republic of China. So this is not something really new.
Oh, that's very helpful. I now have a question that comes both from the audience and from me that was, I think, intended for Evan, but for anybody else for that matter. And I believe that Evan has already gone to fulfill his other responsibilities. So I'm dependent on you, Bonnie, and you, Bill, to help us with this. And that is, how would we compare? Of course, this is somewhat speculative because the second half of the comparison has yet to materialize. But how would we compare what we perceive to be the attitude of the Trump administration toward China and its priorities with what we anticipate will be the Biden administration's attitude, meaning mental image of China, and what we anticipate will be the Biden administration's priorities? And I'm anticipating a significant shift, but I'm hoping, if you do too, that you can describe it.
I'll just be very, very brief because I think the Biden administration is going to inherit quite a changed relationship, and they are likely to do, I think, a policy review and develop their own strategy. But I think that there will be quite a bit of continuity. There is a lot of concern about the same set of issues that the Trump administration was concerned about. Hong Kong, Xinjiang, I think will take on higher priority. We've already, in fact, heard the Biden team during the campaign say that what China is doing in Xinjiang with these camps is actually already something they have called genocide. So I think we will see a really tough response on that. I think we'll continue to see support for Taiwan. It may be done less publicly, but I think that it will continue because there's considerable concern about Taiwan and its future. So you could take this on an issue by issue basis, but I think you will find, if you look at the Indo-Pacific Strategy Report that was just released a couple of days ago, declassified 30 years early, I think that the Biden administration will continue many of those policies. There will be more of an emphasis on human rights, on values, and there will be certainly more effort to work closely with allies and partners. But I think many of their goals will be the same. The way they go about achieving those goals may be quite different. Thank
you. Bill, would you want to add to that?
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. I read the paper that Bonnie just referred to, the current administration's policy statement. Wasn't dated. I'm going to guess it was probably 2.5, 3 years ago. Bonnie, maybe you know, but my assessment after I read the thing was very interesting. What have we accomplished in the last 3 years on this agenda? And I found little to nothing. that's actually been successfully achieved. So I think that it's a wide open field to do something and to do almost anything better. The idea that we whack them, try to inflict pain, just poke them in the eye because we're unhappy with something seems to me to be generally counterproductive. And just if I could, as an example here, so in this wolf warrior stuff, the Chinese have been very interesting, slapping the Australians around in a couple of ways. So there's a big pile of lobsters building up in mainland Australia now that the Chinese aren't eating, and folks in the outback are enjoying them at record low prices. But on the other hand, China can't get enough of the liquid natural gas that Australia is selling them, and so it seems to me that there's a good example here of there are lots of things on the table if we look around and pay attention to what might be put into some kind of a policy going forward to scratch backs on both sides and to try to ratchet down this increasing tension. There are lots of things that could be done, and I would recommend that we do those.
Thank you. The another question that emerges from the audience that I really think we need to address is one of you earlier, I think, mentioned the concept of China being desirous of contributing significantly to the establishment of a new world order. What do you anticipate that world order would look like? Of course, there's a lot of time which will elapse before it arrives, so this is highly speculative. But based on what we know today, what would that world order look like in comparison to what we have today?
I mentioned it, so I'll build on this a little bit. While we've been paying generally little to no attention, Chinese have been very systematically volunteering their people, Chinese people, to world organizations and bodies, international organizations, NGOs, at the top, the UN, and on down to large and small throughout the world, to position themselves in places where they can influence the decisions that these bodies make. And often we take little note of it, but over time, the rest of the world kind of gets used to the idea, in my opinion, of Chinese presence on these various bodies. And over time, the rules begin to be rewritten or influenced to China's favor. So they would like to be setting the policy agenda, in my opinion, rather than what's gone on in past decades, where it's been pretty much our script, and these are the rules, and you'll please follow them. They'd like to flip that around because they believe that, first of all, their system is superior than ours, and that they can leverage this into actions around the world that will be helpful to their agenda. And that agenda, again, is increasing their power and prestige in the world and their ability to influence actions in their favor. So I think that's one of the key aspects of this.
Which aspects of their aspirations, assuming that we can divine them, what aspects of their aspirations should we be worried about, if at all?
Well, clearly the treatment of individuals and the lack of tolerance of any dissent is antithetical to our way of thinking and our beliefs and foundations upon which we act in this country and most of the Western democracies. And if the Chinese can get an acceptance of this kind of behavior in the rest of the world without any pushback, then basically they can pretty much do what they want, and they'll feel a lot more confident in that. And so it seems to me that that's an underlying issue that we're going to have to deal with. And as we look at ways in which we can form a more collaborative, if you would, way ahead in our dealings with China, there's certain things that we're probably and shouldn't be willing to compromise, particularly as it affects individual rights and liberties. That said, China's its own country. What it decides to do inside that country is generally its business. But when it starts reaching out and affecting others that are not quite inside the fold, if you would, and I have in mind Hong Kong, which has gone very rapidly to the anti-democratic side, and Taiwan, not very far away, but certainly a red line for China as they look to the future. They believe it's part of their territory, and sooner or later they're going to be reunited. But their ability to intimidate and influence through whether it's wolf warrior so-called diplomacy or economic coercion or whatever is something that we're going to have to decide when we do something about it. But again, it's, in my opinion, much better if we position ourselves to be able to influence these things without putting ourselves into a direct confrontational position with China.
Well, maybe you've already answered this next question, but I'm going to pose it anyway in case there are additional aspects, and that Bonnie can also add to it. Both of you have mentioned more than once Hong Kong and Taiwan, and a number of people, I think, are very much interested in what should we be doing. At present, it doesn't appear that we're doing anything, at least in my perception, but I'm wondering what we should be doing, if anything.
Well, I'll comment on Taiwan. I think that the Trump administration, as indicated in that strategy paper, recognized that the United States has to shore up deterrence in the Taiwan Strait. Our position has been eroding. Admiral Fallon talked about this earlier. He didn't talk specifically about the anti-access area denial capabilities, but I know he's well aware of them. China is able to impose far greater costs on the United States today than it was previously when we sent aircraft carriers to the area around the Taiwan Strait in 1996. The Chinese didn't have the capabilities to fire at them, and today they have developed far more capabilities than they had then. And so they may or may not have the capabilities to seize and hold Taiwan today, but they are moving in that direction. And so we need to work with Taiwan to strengthen their capabilities. I led, along with my colleagues Mike Green and Richard Bush, a task force on what we should do in our policy toward Taiwan. You can find it on the CSIS website. It's called Toward a Stronger U.S.-Taiwan Partnership, where we make many, many recommendations about what we should do to help expand Taiwan's participation in the international community, to promote its resiliency and its security. Of course, there's much that Taiwan needs to do for itself. And that's very important. But nevertheless, I think there's more that the United States can do with other countries in order to convince Xi Jinping so that if he gets up any day and says, maybe today is the day that I should attack Taiwan, he should rethink that and say the risks are too high, and it might actually put in jeopardy China's achievement of achieving national rejuvenation, the big Chinese dream in 2049. So I think that we have to raise the costs, and we have to make sure that Taiwan continues to be secure and prosperous. I believe that we should negotiate a bilateral free trade agreement with Taiwan. I think that's long overdue. And let's remember that Taiwan has a president today that is not provocative toward China in the way that Chen Shui-bian was early in the 2000s. This is a very different era. So hopefully China will eventually decide that it's one country, two systems offer to Taiwan, which of course has been implemented in Hong Kong, and essentially maybe you can't say it no longer exists, but it is certainly waning and may ultimately disappear in Hong Kong. China should come up with a better offer for Taiwan. if they want to have some kind eventually of integration of some kind with Taiwan, they are going to have to change their policies. So I feel pretty strongly about that, but there's a lot more that the U.S. and like-minded countries can do.
If I could pile on a couple of things that you said, Bonnie, that got my attention. And one was there's a lot that Taiwan can be doing to help itself that it's not doing. And in my experience in working with them, it was a frustration to me that they didn't, particularly militarily, and this is not exceedingly expensive in dollar terms. It's a matter of their own policies and their own decision-making and initiatives to help themselves. And so my view is they haven't been very aggressive in this area at all. And in many respects, I think just saying, no, we're not going to worry about it. The U.S. are going to come bail us out if anything really bad happens. And so they just kind of go along and sing a song and don't worry about it to the extent they should. Too much attention paid to big ticket items, in my opinion, particularly military hardware and things. They could be, it certainly gets attention. It raises tensions. And at the end of the day, because most of it's talk anyway, it doesn't really get there. But I'm with you that they ought to, and we could and should encourage them to do that. At the same time, things that we could do, you mentioned the trade. It's pretty interesting that Taiwan has evolved into the dynamic democracy that it is. If you go back and look from 50, 60 years ago, it's come a long way. And that's really good, and it's something that we should support. But I think some of the actions that have been taken in recent months have not been particularly helpful. And they really go at upsetting these agreements that we had. Go back to the first meeting with Dr. Kissinger and President Nixon, with Mao, when the communiques, the first one was established. And we've been working out of this playbook. But I think now we've deviated from it significantly, and I imagine in Beijing they're kind of going, I wonder what these characters are up to. But regarding the military business, again, there are different ways to come at this. One way that I don't sign up for is the tit for tat. You show me some muscle, and I'll show you some muscle kind of thing. And okay, so you have your new so-called aircraft carriers over there. We'll watch this. We'll move a few of ours in. I wouldn't do that at all. I would work, again, at our own capabilities that we don't have to go boast about. We don't have to go beat our chests in the Taiwan Strait, but we can develop things that could, I believe, get the message across to the PLA that if they decide they might want to get aggressive, they better think twice about it, because there are things that could happen that could really hurt them. Not in a way of intimidation, not in a way of aggressively throwing something in their face, but if we develop these things, they can be used anywhere in the world, and I think they'll see it after a while. And the other thing is, I'm a big fan of not necessarily going nose to nose with somebody when you can get your objective achieved by other means and other places. It's a big world, lots of things that we want to see done, lots of things China would like to do. Chinese wolf behavior, if you would, has not gone down too well in many countries around the world as they've thrown their economic clout and some political clout around. So there are a lot of countries looking for another answer. I think we've helped them immensely. That would be not directly at Taiwan, but could help influence that situation.
Well, thank you. We've got time for, I think, another 1.5 questions. So I'm going to take the one question from the audience, and if there's time for a half question, I'll pose it. So on the one question from the audience, and this is an amalgamation of questions that have already appeared on my screen. Bill, you alluded earlier, in fact, I think it's been an underlying theme of much of what you've said, that, and I think rightfully, that we can't really change other people. Or at least not as easily as we can change ourselves. So what would be the 2 or 3 ways in which the U.S. should change itself if it wants to have a happy outcome relative to our relationship with China?
So there's nothing I think that hasn't been mentioned, at least directly or inferred today. First, we've got to clean up our act politically. Domestic politics, just awful. I mean, I'm here in Washington, and I'm just shaking my head at what's going on across the river. And now we're fortifying the city. It's just ridiculous. It got barriers all over the place and 10,000 troops moving. And what the hell? This is nuts. And so we need to fix ourselves internally, economically. We've been pursuing the punch them in the nose, poke them in the eye, tariffs and sanctions regime for a while. And it ought to be pretty obvious to most people that this is not particularly working particularly well, hardly anywhere. And so, why don't we try a different trick here? Again, demonstrating by working with others, allies, actively encouraging cooperation and alliances and partnerships would go a long way to demonstrating that we're going to be in the game and we want to cooperate and collaborate with people to move forward. So these are pretty obvious things. We also need to do some investment in basic education and not just throwing money at things. I got this crazy idea that the more money we spend, the better it's going to be. That's not working too well. So why don't we think about that one? And then we need some tech investment. I think that we need to reinvigorate our government assistance and support to developing new technologies, which give us lots of options. And again, because our system is done mostly in the commercial world, not in the military world, not in the state world, as it is in China, the natural advantage we have ought to be amplified if we put a little bit of primer in the sauce here.
And Bonnie, would you add to that?
Well, I agree with everything that Admiral Fallon just said. I think our biggest problems are at home. And if we can fix America, if we can restore the ability of different parts of our country to work together and the confidence in government and in our governance, if we can deal with problems of racism, and if we can address tech issues, innovation, invest more R&D, fix our education system. It's such a long list. But if we can do these things, then I think we will naturally be able to restore American leadership around the world, and other countries will be more confident about the United States and about our staying power in Asia and the broader Indo-Pacific. So if we just assert rhetorically that we are a reliable ally, a good friend, but we're not taking care of our problems at home, then I think it tends to fall on deaf ears, and countries will begin to work towards goals without the United States. And in fact, they have already. The fact that the CPTPP was taken over the finish line by Japan was fantastic, but we're not there. We're also not part of the RCEP that was just signed in the region. So economic integration in Asia is going forward without the United States. So I hope that we will rejoin, recommit, become involved, and certainly work with allies and like-minded countries. But first and foremost, we have to fix our problems at home.
Well, I run the danger of getting the hook here. I apparently have 1 more minute for my half a question. So I'm going to pose it anyway out of sheer stubbornness. And that is separating content from style. Admittedly, they're integral parts of one whole, but I do think style makes a huge difference. And we've just experienced an administration with a very unique style, I would say. If you were to, in one sentence, offer advice to the Biden administration on, from a style perspective, what's the best approach to dealing with China? What would you say?
Ronnie?
Oh, come on.
Just to dealing with China, or in our foreign policy more broadly?
In foreign policy more broadly, yeah.
I mean, in foreign policy more broadly, I hope our country will show some humility, that we will learn how to listen, not go around the world arm twisting and dictating. I think that's what America is thought of as that's what we do. And I think that's unfortunate. So I would say we really do need to listen, particularly the Biden administration, even though the Democrats have only been out for 4 years out of power. The world has changed considerably in those last 4 years. And it is imperative that all of these individuals recognize that they can't just pick up where they left off. And I think they know that. So I'm not telling them anything that they don't already know. But we can't make the same assumptions as a country and as diplomats as we made 4 years ago. So I really think we have to re-engage. We have to listen to what other countries want to hear, and particularly regarding how we should deal with China. Because we cannot be effective in dealing with China if we do it unilaterally. And I think that's one of the lessons of the Trump administration.
I would just add,
It's a great answer.
I think it's terrific.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
One thing, I don't know too many people around the world that really like bullies, and they don't like people that get in their face and try to push them around. And so my prescription would be just some confident, respectful diplomacy. It's backed up by competent actions back here domestically that will send a message of confidence to the rest of the world that we know how to behave, and we are going to behave respectfully, and that we are going to be reliable, and that will help us immensely. We have to walk the talk and get it done, and I think it's quite possible to do that in short order.
So I think those are both two amazingly good answers. And if the Biden administration follows your formula, I have no doubt that we'll be much more successful. So thank you very much. There's going to be hell to pay for me tomorrow with Margaret for going over a minute and a half. But Margaret, it's back to you.
Thanks, Ken, very much. Yeah, a minute and a half. We'll talk to you later. Thank you to you, to Admiral Fallon, and to Bonnie. We could have spent a full day on that topic, and we have lots to monitor here at Asia Society, particularly around Hong Kong and Taiwan.